We know that Chinese Canadian parliamentarians and Chinese Canadians in general are targets, greater targets for interference by China than others. And we get updated regularly on how we can make sure that our integrity and that the work that Canadians do to serve in politics is done with full protections.
Okay, so we know the Chinese government has attempted to interfere in Canada's elections, but how exactly does it do it, and how deep does it go? Cherie Wong is the executive director of Alliance Canada Hong Kong. Her group authored the report In Plain Sight, Beijing's Unrestricted Network of Foreign Influence in Canada. Cherie Wong, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
We're talking a lot about foreign interference and what it looks like in elections. What does foreign interference look like for you and the people you spoke to?
First of all, it is nonpartisan and happening at all levels of government. So we see actually more intensified forms of foreign influence in elections at the municipal and school board level than federal and provincial levels.
So we're focusing on the federal level, but it's happening at the much lower levels in government. It's that pervasive?
Absolutely. I think state actors are taking advantage of the lack of awareness at the lower levels of government. And frankly, less resources could be mobilized for a much more impactful campaign at the lower levels of government.
What does it look like? The conversation has been about how the diaspora, how Chinese Canadians are really directly targeted by agents of the regime in Beijing. What does it look like for people?
It ranges anywhere from disinformation and misinformation campaigns on Chinese social media like WeChat, Weibo, but it also looks like key influencers and community leaders mobilizing for specific candidates for support or sabotage.
And that's just in the election period, you mean? Support, like they will rally behind a preferred candidate or actively work against a non-preferred candidate?
Absolutely, but it's also happening outside of election cycles. A lot of the mobilization and the community work is being done outside of election campaigns. And once the writ drops, they're able to quickly mobilize for specific campaigns or candidates.
We've heard reports about pressure on individuals, intimidation, maybe of family members back home in China. What's your experience with that? What have you seen and heard about that phenomenon?
The threats and harassment and intimidation are very real against diasporic members, but those are the most extreme forms of control. There are other forms of control like social pressure, like having a business deal for your business if you show support for a specific candidate. So we have to be very careful, but also detailed in our examination of these foreign influence tactics. Not all of them fall strictly in a legal or illegal framework.
Right, so it's like a carrot and stick thing. If you're on the right side of an issue, maybe your business gets a contract, maybe it gets something, and if you're on the wrong side of it, you get excluded from it, that kind of thing?
Absolutely, and it is a very popular tactic and what the diaspora would often describe as relationships, 关系, how one can build a relationship through acts of loyalty or acts of support.
On the intimidation and the threats, you called that the extreme end of it. How common would that be, for example? Because we have tried, and you and I spoke about this before the interview, we've tried to get people to come on the show to talk about this, and people are afraid because of family consequences, because of the business consequences you outlined. How common is that level of real overt, say, threat and intimidation?
Oh, well, I'm showing my face here today, so that threat is very real for me. But I think it needs to be clear there is a climate of fear that already exists. So many diasporic members don't even make it to the consideration of whether or not to speak up. They have chosen complacency. They have chosen to be silent because they don't even want to put themselves at the risk of angering the regime.
How do you deal with it then? You're here, you're on camera, you're going to be on national television. How do you protect yourself? How do you protect your family? I
do my best with security measures I've implemented. But I don't talk to my family. I don't talk to my friends back home. I think that, at least I believe that by staying distant from them, I could protect them. But I don't know. They may be threatened tomorrow. They may be called into the police station tomorrow. I wouldn't know.
You've cut off all ties with your family because of the concerns about their safety for your activism?
For those who are in China and Hong Kong, yeah.
Well, I guess you've cut off ties, but have they let you know how they feel about that? I mean, that's an enormous sacrifice for you to make.
It's not a sacrifice. It's about my survival here as a Canadian, as a Hong Konger, and I believe that I need to fight for my community, and if that puts me in the crossfire of Beijing's overreach, then that's the reality I have to live in.
I know the Chinese Canadian community is not a monolith, right? And they're separate and distinct from the government in China. What's the conversation in the diaspora, as you can see it, over the last couple of weeks, with these allegations of interference from Beijing and sort of the ripple effect throughout Canadian society that has caused?
I think most community members have said, "I told you so." These types of allegations have been coming out since the 90s, and it is only now that they're in public discourse in such a significant way. But I think the communities have also lost its trust in Canadian institutions. It took so long for us to get attention on these issues, but will there be change? Will there be real actions? We don't know.
What do you make of the political debate and discourse that's happened? I mean, is it helpful? Is it appropriate given the reality of the situation as you see it?
I think it is important to take a nonpartisan approach, but also a country-agnostic approach. Canada and China aren't the only two countries in this discussion. There are other foreign and hostile nations who are undertaking foreign influence activities here in Canada. It is only China that's being made it on the headlines, but I think we need to broaden the conversation to address all of the hostility that we are facing in our democratic systems.
You mentioned the headlines. Are we doing a bad job of this in the media? And I'm a big boy, I can take it. I mean, like I mentioned to you earlier, we have struggled to get people from the Chinese Canadian community to come on for various reasons, as you've outlined. But do you think we're taking the appropriate tone, the appropriate language on this? I mean, how do you think the Canadian media has done in dealing with this issue?
That's a complex question. It was disappointing to see all white panelists in various news media speaking on an issue that the diaspora knows best. I think there are practices that the media needs to change and adapt to welcome diasporic voices. I choose to show my face and name today, but there are other community members who are way more knowledgeable than I am. But because of this real name association thing, they wouldn't want to show up to speak to the media. But I think it's another issue about regaining the diasporic's trust.
The Prime Minister this week said a lot of the questions and the allegations here can fuel anti-Asian racism, an issue we saw during COVID, during the pandemic, and sort of now he feels is rippling into this. I wonder, do you have any reaction to that comment from the Prime Minister and how that's playing out in these developments?
I don't think anti-Asian hate should be used as a shield to the very real concerns that the diaspora is experiencing. It is true that certain discourse and narratives will fuel anti-Asian racism in this country, and it's already happening. But it doesn't excuse us from tackling the very real issues of foreign influence happening, not just electorally, but at all levels of government, in all facets of Canadian society.
So how do we get to this level of trust? Like, I want to thank you for your trust in coming in today and sitting down and talking with us, but for government to regain trust in the diaspora community, for the media to earn that trust in the diaspora community, so more voices can be on and can be heard, and they can tell us firsthand what they're experiencing and what the solutions might be. I mean, how do we do that? What's the remedy?
You have to meet us at where our needs are at. The diaspora needs safety and security, and that means not necessarily showing their real name and their real face. That means that our concerns need to be listened to, and there needs to be action associated to listening to us. It's a long road. There's going to be a long journey to be able to rebuild that trust, but I think we're at the starting point.
You mentioned the trust government institutions. One of the things your group has recommended is a permanent government foreign influence center or institution in some capacity. There's been a lot of talk about a foreign agent registry. This is separate and distinct from that. How do you envision that being set up, and what good do you think something like that can do here?
We look to Australia's foreign influence transparency scheme, where foreign actors or foreign affiliated actors have to register to show that they are affiliated with a foreign state. I think something similar, but extending beyond the political sector. If there are foreign funding in nonprofit organizations, in the private sector, in academia, then we as Canadians should be informed of who we're getting into contracts with and collaborations with. I think awareness and sunlight is what we need when it comes to foreign influence.
It sounds like we don't know the half of it, 10% of it, 20% of it, that you're not surprised at all by these revelations because you've been living this. And I just wonder, how blind do you think the country is to what's actually been going on?
I think when you read our report in plain sight, if the facts of this report shock you, then you've been living under a rock.
Cherie Wong, thank you so much for coming in. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Alleged Chinese election meddling is dominating the headlines right now, but China is not the only state targeting Canada, and the meddling is not just confined to elections. Canada's Security and Intelligence Service has publicly identified 3 countries engaged in what it's called foreign interference in Canada. Those countries, not surprisingly, China, Russia, and Iran. So what is foreign interference? Well, CSIS defines it as activities that are detrimental to the interests of Canada and are clandestine or deceptive or involve a threat to any person. So what more do we know about these activities, and what's the end game here? Akshay Singh is an international affairs and security scholar who is currently a research associate with the University of Ottawa Centre for International Policy Studies. Mr. Singh is in Vancouver. Dennis Molinaro is a professor of legal studies at Ontario Tech University. He previously worked as a national security analyst with the federal government, and Professor Molinaro is in Oshawa, Ontario. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me. Actually, I'd like to start with you if we could. We just heard the CSIS legislative definition for foreign interference. In practice, the tactics, what does it look like?
So I think the most important thing to focus on in that definition is the clandestine or deceptive or constituting a threat to a person. And that delineates it from normal foreign influence, which all states can do on each other. That's normal diplomatic behavior that's engaging with the foreign government openly. The reason why foreign interference is clandestine or deceptive is because people are not being transparent about what they're doing. They're acting on behalf of a foreign government without declaring their intent or their interests. And that puts it into the firmly bad behavior territory. I think one thing to be very cognizant of is that the CSIS definition, given that it's a security intelligence service, is not necessarily one that can lead to prosecution. And the RCMP has a different definition for foreign interference, which it uses more of a legalistic term, saying that it has to be illegal. So important to realize that there's no national definition on this issue.
Okay, so Dennis, we've got the definitions and we've got the tactics. What's the end game here for the nation-state actors engaged in foreign interference activities in Canada, and how does it differ from state to state?
Sure. I mean, well, even just that definition alone, I mean, sometimes causes confusion, I think, because even when you think of it in terms of elections, for instance, the insinuation is that someone is trying to meddle in some way, disrupt or stop in some capacity, when really the end goal here can actually be more influence-minded, right? Where some state might be really interested in actually targeting elites in a target society, be they business leaders, be they academics, be they politicians, and try to influence them, and essentially influence them to a degree to represent the interests of the hostile state, and then either to clamp down on dissent, or it could be actually to maybe pass legislation or policy that might be of interest to the target state or the hostile state. And so then what you really end up with is influence actually along a sliding scale can become interference, where the person is now in service of a foreign state, acting in their interests and carrying out their agenda. And it's different for different countries. China is more, as I just described, and it's not mutually exclusive either, because Russia would sometimes be looking for the same thing. But typically in the past, their activities have more been about disruption, about causing a little bit of chaos, disinformation, causing doubt in things like elections. So it's different depending on the state.
So actually, CSIS Director David Vigneault said yesterday that the principal threat for foreign interference here comes from Beijing. Why is Beijing so focused on Canada? What does it want?
Well, there are a few things at once. I agree with Dennis in saying that, hostile states that conduct foreign interference in Canada benefit from chaos. I agree the Russians have benefited strongly from chaos. But I think what China wants to achieve in places like Canada is that it wants to make sure that there's no quote unquote united front that's in the democratic world that's opposing China's bad behavior internationally or opposing Chinese national interests. And Canada is an important member of the Five Eyes community. This is the traditional intelligence collection partnership between the US, Australia, UK, New Zealand, and Canada. We share information to deter intelligence activities conducted by China. We're an important member of G7, G20. We have economic activities that are of interest to China. We supply natural resources, we have advanced technologies. All of this means that we're higher on the radar than I think a lot of Canadians realize. And most importantly, I think we're a close ally of the United States. So importantly for countries like China, it's to have countries like Canada not go along with US or democratic efforts to challenge China's behavior internationally or to highlight the behavior of what China is doing internally in its own country when things like human rights violations or behaviors in Xinjiang or Hong Kong come up.
Right. So, Dennis, we've been understandably very focused on the election interference, right, because of the headlines over the last couple of weeks. But the kind of activity, it's not just about elections. It is a constant thing, correct?
Correct. I mean, we've seen this from other people, other commentators, experts, and community members as well. I mean, this is activity that is ongoing and is particularly pernicious and widespread and very targeted and directed at ethnic communities in Canada. So, like the Chinese Canadian community, the Iranian Canadian community. These are people who are a lot of them having to deal with this quite often in an everyday capacity. And so, this is activity that let's say China, if we're talking about China, is engaging in on a regular basis and trying to, as Akshay had mentioned, silence, critics, silence dissents, cause divisions, could break up Canada from other its allied partners. But so it's also happening in the community. It's happening in widespread areas of society. Our allies have identified it happening in municipal politics, in state politics, across the board, and in academic institutions as well.
So actually, who does Beijing primarily target in these interference activities? The focus is on the diaspora community, but it's more specific than that, I'm going to guess?
Yeah, so I think there are two ways to think about this. The Chinese diaspora community tends to be the community that the Chinese government and the Communist Party of China wants to interfere in the most so they can control the narrative that A, these communities witness in foreign countries, and B, are able to spread themselves. So what I'm trying to say here is that, to some extent, the Chinese government sees like it has a degree of ownership over Chinese diaspora communities abroad. This is not just in Canada. And the United Front Work Department, which is a department under the Communist Party of China, actually looks to enable that. They have overseas Chinese groups that they engage with. They try to control the narrative of various community groups or associations and try to influence them into thinking a certain way about China. So that's one piece. The second piece is all those groups that are outside the diaspora, because yes, the diaspora is a primary target, I would argue, of Chinese foreign interference efforts, and they suffer the most. But all the other non-diaspora groups that could be of interest are also equally targeted. So these are people who are not necessarily directly involved in Chinese official politics. These are people who are elected officials who are appointed by the government, business leaders, academics, as Dennis has highlighted, that are not in the diaspora. They're as fair game of being targeted as is the diaspora.
So Dennis, CSIS Director Vigneault yesterday told MP something that just jumped out at me, that the United Front Work Department that Akshay just mentioned, their primary method for foreign interference, it has a larger budget than China's foreign ministry. I mean, what does that say about the importance Beijing places on these foreign interference activities?
Well, I mean, there's a reason that the director and other heads of intelligence services abroad in our allied partner countries are saying that China is leading the pack here, and it's because of the amount of resources they devote to this. And the United Front Work Department, the UFWD, is not new either. I mean, it's been around for a long time. But really, the efforts here have been ramped up steadily over the years. And really, in the last 10 years or so, it's really started to really kind of escalate. So it's the level of resources that China devotes to this is really unprecedented. And it makes it much more difficult because, as Akshay has pointed out too, the targets of this vary, right? The targets that China is looking at in terms of people they're trying to influence, it's very broad. And so that makes it a very difficult thing to stop, because you're not necessarily looking for, for trying to stop it. You're not looking for trained intelligence officers, so to speak. You're looking for people who could be co-opted by China. And it's much harder to try to detect that foreign state linkage.
So actually, just put it in some context for me. Do any other countries have anything even comparable to the United Front Work Department? Are there any historical comparisons to this?
Well, I mean, the easiest historical comparison is the Soviet Union, but I think China currently probably operates the largest foreign interference mechanism that's outside our understanding of how normally intelligence organizations operate. And I think one thing to understand about United Front Work is, while the department sets guidelines for people to abide by that are according to the interests of the Communist Party of China, China's national intelligence organizations also have to conduct United Front work. So this means the Ministry of State Security, the Ministry of Public Security, they're also conducting these activities as well. And it can be quite sophisticated. This doesn't mean that everyone is working lockstep with each other, because we have to remember that China is the original bureaucracy. They also have bureaucratic issues, but it does mean that the number of resources just goes beyond the United Front Work Department. You have to include the other arms and organs of the party, as well as the party state. So it's quite significant. I don't think there's any kind of normal comparison you can make at this point.
Okay, so Dennis, just as a quick final point, is Canada, I mean, how do you even begin to counter that? I mean, has Canada done enough to counter all of that?
No, not at all. I mean, NSICOP has already been identifying, foreign interference as a growing threat in the country and making recommendations year after year that really haven't been implemented. So we need to be doing a lot more, and this is exposing why we need to be doing a lot more. The first step, one of the more quicker steps, I guess you could say, might be to really put in a foreign agent registry.
Right.
Have that in place. We've heard it already. We need FI laws. That would help as well. I mean, these are measures that we can be starting to work on immediately, and I think we should get started.
Okay, great conversation, guys. Really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you so much to Akshay Singh and Dennis Molinaro. Thanks so much.